Hello and welcome to Radicals in Conversation, the monthly podcast from Pluto Press, one of the world's leading independent radical publishers. I'm your host, Chris Brown. As the world grapples with the escalating climate crisis, our planet's future hangs in the balance. For centuries, our legal systems have treated nature as something to be owned and exploited for human gain. In recent decades, the tenor of the conversation may have shifted towards conservation and protection, but nature remains an object. The environmental laws, treaties, and international agreements we enact have little impact. Ecosystems continue to collapse. Global temperatures continue to rise. But a bold new movement is challenging this paradigm, calling time on inadequate anthropocentric lawmaking and ushering in an exciting new ecocentric approach based on the rights of nature. I'm joined on the show today by Jessica Den Outer, an expert in environmental law and the author of the new book, The Forest Fights Back, a global movement for the rights of nature. We talk about the history of this new legal movement and dive into some of the challenges that it's facing and the opportunities that it's creating around the world. We look at the legal personality of the Whanganui River in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the enshrining of the rights of nature into the National Constitution in Ecuador, and the strength of the grassroots movement around the Mar Menor in Spain. The Forest Fights Back is out from Pluto Press in January 2026. As ever, podcast viewers can get 40% off the book through plutobooks.com. You just have to use the coupon podcast at the checkout. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode. This is Jessica Den Outer on Radicals in Conversation. So Jessica, thank you very much for joining me on the podcast today. It's a real pleasure to get to sit down and talk to you about your new book. It's called The Forest Fights Back, a global movement for the rights of nature. It's out in January 2026, so if you're listening to this in December, it's just a few weeks away, but for everyone else, it's out now and available from all good bookshops and on plutobooks.com. So maybe we could just start with the obvious things. Could you maybe introduce yourself for our viewers and for our listeners, and maybe tell us a little bit about your own, personal story? What has your journey been towards this interest and expertise that you have in the rights of nature?
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show. I'm calling in from Amsterdam, but it's great that we've got online venues to have this conversation. And I'm really, really excited for Pluto to publish this book in the beginning of the new year. So my name is Jessica Den Outer. I am from the Netherlands, as you might have heard by now. And I grew up with a grandfather who would take me out in our little garden and basically crawling through the grass on hands and knees. He would show me all the different sort of bugs and ants and butterflies that live there. And I suppose that's where my sort of great love for nature was born. But as a teenager, I had quite a strong sense of justice. So when I went on to study environmental law, I could sort of combine that personal passion for nature and my interest in law and society in general. But I think throughout my legal studies, I quite soon realized that our legal systems still treat nature as something that we can own and exploit. So it felt like, I was studying all these laws and regulations to protect nature, but at the same time, I was watching the news and I kept hearing about, biodiversity loss and climate change accelerating, and I just couldn't sort of put those things together in my legal studies. And that's what motivated me to look beyond what I knew as a legal law student. And I found the rights of nature, which is not just sort of a change in law, but also a different way of our worldview, how we treat nature, how we look at, mountains, forests, and rivers. So that's where my sort of passion for the rights of nature began in 2017. I've done research for the United Nations, into different countries that have embedded this in their laws. And I wrote a book about it, which is coming out pretty soon.
So you've already kind of alluded to we have endless sort of environmental policies and protections and laws and agreements in place already. And so I guess a lot of people will be skeptical of the efficacy of a legal approach, right? And because of this, the fact that little heed is paid to all of these protections that might exist sort of at the international level or at the local level or whatever. So what is different about this movement for the rights of nature to sort of recognize and legally enshrine rights of nature that might give us more cause for optimism, I suppose?
Yes, definitely. I think that realization came pretty soon as a law student. As I mentioned, I was studying so many laws and regulations that were quite technical. So, for example, in Europe, we've got something called Natura 2000, which sort of tells us how many species we need to have present in a nature area for it to be healthy and for it to be protected. And I think this is, just one example of quite a lot of technical laws and regulations that we have. And it still sort of views nature as an object, something, we can own, exploit for our own gain, but it's also an object of protection. And I think what the rights of nature fundamentally does is shifting that approach from treating nature as an object towards a rights holder, a subject of its own. And if you compare it to sort of human rights and corporate personhood, the question soon arises, if companies can have rights, why not a river that is alive? Why should just humans have a right to life and not ecosystems themselves? So I feel like this is a movement that goes beyond law, and it's a cultural shift as well. And I feel like if we don't sort of tackle the way we view nature, our old worldview, nothing's going to change really from traditional environmental law.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really interesting to read in the book about this idea of legal personality or legal personhood, because as you've just alluded to there, corporations can have legal personality, so can ships. And it was interesting to learn in the book, I think, the Indian Supreme Court also potentially sees, Hindu idols as having legal personality. So this is not something that is like a new idea here, that, non-humans can have this. What does legal personality actually entail as like a legal category in practice?
This is actually, I feel like my life's mission, because legal concepts are quite difficult, but I'm hoping I'm going to explain it in an accessible and easy way, but please intervene if I don't. I think, well, legal personhood is something that most people might know as something, that companies can have. In certain countries, even government entities like municipalities can have a legal personhood. And it's basically the recognition that something is a someone rather than a something. This means that companies are regarded as legal persons for the law, with their own interests, with their own sort of guardians that speak out on their behalf. Companies and their representatives can enter into contracts and all sorts of matters that regard human society. It can have rights and responsibilities basically in a legal system. And when you would regard nature as a legal person, it sort of means that we no longer treat it as an object or a piece of property, something, that we can try to protect, but most often within environmental law, we see economic interests prevail. So when it gains rights, like the right to exist, to flow, to regenerate, we often assign guardians that can speak on behalf of that legal person, the forest, for example, and they could go to court on its behalf, just like lawyers can for children. But it's basically just a legal tool, really, to give nature a voice in that whole sort of decision-making process. And I think it's also good to mention that legal personhood is just one of the many examples of how we can establish rights of nature. And that's why in the Forest Fights Back, I sort of go on this, worldwide journey, telling the stories of different countries that have embedded different legal tools to give nature that voice in their systems.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely true. I think there's examples of the Ganges River or like the Whanganui River in Aotearoa in New Zealand, where there's been this kind of legal personhood and with different degrees of success, admittedly, and then other examples where that hasn't been the route that's been adopted. And so we'll get into some of these case studies definitely in some more depth. And again, I think you've touched on the legal construct of guardianship? Because I guess, for some people, the fact that, rivers or forests can't talk, can't appear in court themselves might logically seem to preclude their participation in like a legal process. But, that's not a valid argument. And this legal construct of guardianship is not new. Again, this is something that already exists in the legal system for, minors and so on, and is now being used in some instances here. So I guess we should talk about the history of this movement, right? And actually maybe using this idea of guardianship as the bridge here, because you give us this really interesting story about Mineral King, this subalpine glacial valley in California, which was the subject of a fierce sort of legal battle in the 60s and 70s, and had sort of big I guess, consequences for demonstrating the necessity of the rights of nature and a different way of approaching the protection of, ecosystems and so on. Could you tell us a little bit more about this story? Because it was quite an interesting one, and it also kind of dovetails, I guess, with, this article that Christopher D. Stone wrote in 1972 called "Should Trees Have Standing?" So, yeah, could you tell us a little bit of this interesting early history?
Yeah, I think the reason why I'm so excited about this sort of court case that really illustrates the need for rights of nature is because it was happening in 1972. I think a year that many of us in the environmental movement know as the year of the Club of Rome, with its report coming out, this Stockholm conference where countries finally got together to speak about, the need to protect the environment. But not a lot of people know that, there was this court case going on in Northern California that sort of sparked this whole global movement, which is why I was so excited to write about it in this book. And it's basically a story about sequoias, so the giant old trees in Northern California that can live up to 1,000 years old. And the United States government in around 1965 sort of told private parties that they could acquire a piece of a glacial valley that lies near the Sequoia National Park, where these old trees stand. And they sort of said that, this area would be suited for all sorts of recreational purposes. Because a glacial valley has a U form, and, I think the word implies it already. There's a lot of snow that covers this area. The government sort of thought that this would be great for people to build a skiing resort, for example, a true winter sports paradise, they called it. And this led to Walt Disney to actually make an offer on this area and sort of start plans to create this skiing resort, this world-class skiing resort in this precious area where these giant trees have been standing for 1,000 years. And people sort of followed that lawsuit, or that development. And at some point thought, who's sort of taking into account the interests of these trees? Like, who's standing up and speaking on behalf of these trees? So they started legal action that ended up all the way in the highest court, basically, that you can go to as a citizen in the US. And that's where something revolutionary happened, because basically these people were using the law to say, we are standing up for the beauty, the ecology of this area. We're standing up for the trees. And the judges said, well, great that you're sort of trying to do this, but the legal system is about human interests. So you can't appear in court here today to speak on behalf of that nature area. Afterwards, there was this one judge who wrote a dissenting opinion, which is basically something you can do as a judge. You can, sort of have a different opinion than your fellow judges and then write a piece on it. And in that piece, he sort of wrote, it's interesting how we had this whole lawsuit that were essentially about this nature area, but somehow in the whole process, we forgot to think of the interests of nature itself. And therefore, he actually even said, I suppose that this whole lawsuit should have named Mineral King, which was a nature area, versus the other party. And I think he did something revolutionary there, because he started to think of the interests of nature itself. And this was sort of the legal background for Christopher Stone to write an article called "Should Trees Have Standing?", which was the first article by a jurist that explained the concept of rights of nature and sort of laid its groundwork. But I think it's good to note here that, even though this was the first legal piece on the rights of nature, the concept of nature having a voice and a place in systems have been existent for hundreds of years in all sorts of indigenous peoples worldwide. And they are the true leaders and starters, really, of this global movement.
I think what you're saying there is really important because, again, you talk about in the book how this is not a movement that's about humans granting or bestowing new rights on the natural world, but rather recognizing that, it already has rights. And it's just about our kind of worldview catching up with that and the legal sort of system catching up with that. So it's an important distinction to make, I guess. So, the book deals with, I guess, these case studies from around the world, right? So there's a few from the US. There's, I've already talked about the Whanganui River in Aotearoa in New Zealand, India, I think there's Bangladesh as well, Colombia and Ecuador in South America, Spain and Britain as well. So there's kind of all of these really interesting case studies. But, the book doesn't shy away from some of the challenges and setbacks that the rights of nature movement has, faced as well. And I think that's probably to its credit, right? It's not trying to put a gloss on something. And I think the case studies from the USA are particularly interesting because, on the one hand, the stories in the book, they demonstrate that a rights of nature approach, isn't something that's only going to work in one particular place. It's something that is being taken up all across the globe. But there are going to still be different challenges that the movement faces in different places. And a couple of the examples from the US are really interesting to reflect on when we think about scale. The Tamaqua Borough in Pennsylvania, which is home to about 7,000 people, I think, they created this local ordinance in 2006, which appointed ecosystems as persons before the law. And then 4 years later in 2010, I think the city of Pittsburgh becomes the first major American city to recognize the rights of nature as well. So these are inspiring examples of local action, but they're also not these sort of unmitigated success stories. And the same is true for the case of Orange County, Florida. So I'd be interested to hear you say maybe a little bit more about any or all of those three examples, because there are some really innovative and energizing dimensions to those stories, but they also met challenges or failures. So there's lessons that I guess we need to learn from them. Could you tell us about any of these three examples?
Yes, I think what really excited me about writing this book was being able to sort of tell the stories of different rights of nature. So, ranging from the Constitution in Ecuador all the way to Tamaqua Borough, which is a small place only in the US, but that did make global history in sort of enshrining rights of nature in their local laws. But that, especially because rights of nature is such a young movement, we do face a lot of sort of setbacks and challenges. And well, let me sort of dive into some of those challenges that we have seen, for example, in the US as well. And then, I've sort of worked on something in my mind to deal with those challenges and to put it into a broader perspective. But I think what, some of the cities and counties in the US have shown us is that what is quite difficult about local successes, which are really inspiring because it's, local citizens standing up against polluters. It's local citizens, giving voice to their local forests and rivers and mountains. In the US, it's quite difficult because higher levels can sort of override those local rights of nature ordinances, for example. So you might have a success on a local level, but then a higher state legislator will pass a law that sort of render that ineffective. So yeah, state law has a huge role there that can sort of nullify it. Um, and I think what is, most interesting about the rights of nature as well is that it sort of challenges this idea of property over land as well. And for example, not only in the US, but Western countries all over the world that strongly protect private property and economic interest, it might be received as a threat, which also leads to politicians, finding ways to sort of nullify those rights of nature recognitions. And then, of course, a global sort of challenge will stay with the rights of nature about representation. Who is the proper voice for nature? How can we ensure that those people only speak on behalf of nature and not, sort of secretly try to speak on behalf of economic interests? So yeah, these are, it's not just legal challenges, as in how do we fit a new notion of nature protection into an old system that is still built on a different worldview as to how we relate to nature. It's also political challenges and business oppositions. But I can sort of deal with all of this because of Christopher Stone, actually, who wrote Should Trees Have Standing in 1972, because he sort of foresaw that he would meet a lot of opposition on the rights of nature because it's such a new idea. And he sort of places in the broader timeline of history where rights were at once only established for an elite group in society. Only men who paid a certain amount of taxes would gain the right to vote. This is where the whole concept of rights comes from. And right now, I don't think anyone would try to challenge, even though we have difficulties in implementation, that each and every human being has fundamental rights to life, to education, all sorts of rights. And these are based on norms and values. And as these shift over time, Christopher Stone said the next legal revolution or emancipation might be that we recognize that it's not just humans that have a right to life on this planet, but it's also these old sequoias of 1,000 years old, or the rivers that sustain us. So I can sort of place this in the broader history perspective
Yeah.
and timeline to deal with those challenges. And I am, optimistic of our legal efforts to overcome them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you're right to place it in this longer arc of history. And, I think the chapter in the book on the Whanganui River was really probably one of the most well-known examples, maybe internationally, of the rights of nature. So, this is a river that secured legal personality in 2017. But, the river is this subject of a much longer history of contestation, dating back to the arrival of British colonizers, 150 years ago. Could you tell us a little bit about this river and this longer history that led up to the legal personality being, recognized? Again, because this is talking about that long arc of indigenous people, their practices and knowledge being subjugated, and now there being some sort of reckoning with that, which the river's legal personality being secured is attempting to do in some respect. So yeah, could you tell us more about the Whanganui River?
Yeah, this is actually within the rights of nature movement one of the most well-known examples because, in 2017, when this law was enacted for the Whanganui River, it became the first river in the world to become a legal person. And to be honest, this was quite a difficult story to write down because it's got so much cultural context. So, compared to other rights of nature laws and regulations, this is really a story that's so cultural about the Maori, rather than, sort of the need to protect nature in a different way. So I tried my best to write it down, but this is a conflict between the Maori and the New Zealand government, the colonizers, that had been endured for over 150 years, that related to all sorts of traditional rights that the Maori had, but that were not respected. And that conflict actually extended to the Whanganui River. I believe the third longest river in New Zealand, in the northern part of the island. And what is so beautiful about it, when I dove into this and spoke to those Maori leaders, is that they said, we sort of view this river as a living and indivisible whole, from its source in the mountains to where it ends in the sea. It's a living being, and we have a spiritual relationship with that river as well. Now, when the British settlers came, the whole management sort of that river changed. Rather than regarding it as a whole, it was divided into manageable portions with boundaries, something that we in Western countries can certainly relate to. And also, the river became unhealthy because of pollution and all sorts of activities that were sort of legally permitted around the river. So, a long process of petitions, lawsuits, all sorts of legal actions that the Maori tried to take to protect this river. And a compromise was reached in 2017 when together they decided that the river should have its own legal personality, which became global news because it was the first time that a river would be assigned such a status. And what's interesting is that, the way that this law is constructed is it really looks like the legal personhood that companies have as well. So the sort of the people that speak on behalf of the river and can represent its legal interests are a combination of representatives from the New Zealand government and the local Maori leaders. These guardians sort of are tasked with only speaking on behalf of the interests of the river, and there's a whole sort of system of checks and balances set up to ensure that these guardians really do only speak on behalf of the river. And as a jurist, I can really enjoy reading this law because it literally says something amongst the lines of these people will act as the human face of the river. And what I found really interesting about this example as well is when I read about this in 2017, it actually sparked my journey into the rights of nature. And ever since I followed it, because I thought as a jurist that this was bound to lead to lawsuits or legal cases, because, if nature becomes a legal person, it will have all sorts of capabilities, and these representatives can actually start legal actions over the river. But ever since, up to 2026, there have been no lawsuits regarding this river in New Zealand. When I spoke to the people involved, they actually told me that it changed the whole sort of dialogue. It wasn't necessary anymore to start lawsuits after all the harm had been done to the river, because preemptively they were invited at the decision-making table to protect and stand up and defend the interests of the river itself. So, I think this is an example that we use in Europe as well, mostly, when we are faced with criticism or challenges as to this leading to more illegal actions or difficult lawsuits that cost a lot of money and time. This is a great example to show that if we create a space for nature's voice in the processes that are about nature, and have people represent those interests well, it might actually lead to better decision making without the need for reactive lawsuits that happen after the harm had been done.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you were talking about the local Maori leaders there, and, I think they were quoted in the book as saying, it's not about being litigious. It's not about actually using the courts to go after whoever, but it's just about that recognition of that, change in people's attitudes towards it. It's that preemptive kind of element that's, I guess, more important. And you're talking about the cultural significance of this as well. I think you say the content of the act, that granted legal personhood in 2017, you say it reads like poetry and, regards the river as having both physical and metaphysical elements. So, this is definitely going beyond what we think of as like traditional, like legal language or, anything like that. So that does feel to be this qualitative difference. We talked about the fact that legal personhood isn't the only way that rights of nature is being pursued. And, if this is a sort of success story, albeit one that's very much embedded in that long history of colonialism and everything there, what can we learn from maybe an unsuccessful attempt to confer legal personhood on a river? I'm thinking about the Ganges in India and the Yamuna rivers as well, because there were clearly some complexities and challenges that were faced there that ultimately led that to not being successful. Could you say a little bit more about what some of these differences are and what some of the challenges were that were faced in those examples?
Well, sort of skepticism in Western Europe like to point out that the river in New Zealand, is embedded on an island, which sort of made it easier in a way for New Zealand to have this law enacted. Whereas in India, a lawsuit regarding pollution of the Ganges River led to local judges speaking out and recognizing rights of rivers. So this is already an example of how rights of nature are implemented differently around the world. So in New Zealand, it was a national law that created the legal person as a river. But in India, judges spoke out in a lawsuit and recognized the rights of rivers. After a higher court in India actually stayed that decision and stated that it would be quite difficult to work out legal personhood for rivers in India because the Ganges, for example, runs through multiple countries. And
Yeah.
how would you deal with a river that has legal personhood in one but is polluted in another where such legal personhood is not recognized? And this is exactly sort of the challenges that we face in Europe as well. Me coming from the Netherlands, for example, we have quite a lot of rivers running through our country, but our neighboring countries as well. So it's always a question of where does it sort of end, and in what level should you cooperate internationally with other countries to enact this. But I hope sort of this story already shows that even within one country, it's quite difficult to enact a Rights of Nature Act, let alone working together with multiple countries on a Rights of Nature Act. That being said, I wanted to share the story of India to demonstrate what legal challenges we face. But what I found quite interesting is that in Bangladesh, its neighboring country, the judges did not see a problem in recognizing the rights of the almost 200 rivers that run through Bangladesh. So, I suppose it all comes down to sort of a bit of bravery as well on the politician side and lawmaker side to make a stance and to join this global growing movement. And this is what we have seen in Spain as well, for example. We sort of need these first cases to demonstrate how the rights of nature will work. And to me, this is a demonstration as well of this very Western mindset, which is that we sort of need to know everything, need to know all the little details of what will happen in the future and what it will actually bring about before we act. And to me, as sort of the climate crisis is escalating and ecosystems are collapsing, we need to dare to sort of experiment a bit as well.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And this makes me think about the example you give of Ecuador in the book as well, which was, I think, the first country in the world to incorporate the rights of nature into its national constitution. And I think, again, what you're saying about how they didn't have all of the, I's dotted and T's crossed when this came in. There's been this evolution of the rights of nature in Ecuador, and I think that becomes apparent when you look at the difference between, two rulings in that country, the one on the Condor Mirador project lawsuit of 2013, and then the Los Cedros cloud forest case 8 years later. It makes sense that a new legal concept like the rights of nature might take time for lawyers and judges to learn how to put into practice. So, could you say a little bit more about how the rights of nature has evolved, even in this kind of relatively short space of time within Ecuador in the last, decade or so?
Ecuador wrote world history when they embedded the rights of nature in their constitution in 2008. And as for many countries around the world, the constitution is the highest law that we have in a country. Generally, it's said that constitutions embed the norms and values of society. So to have the recognition that Pachamama, Mother Earth, has a right to exist, to thrive, to evolve, to regenerate, and a right to restoration was huge, besides the recognition that, humans have rights as well. Again, Ecuador was also met with criticism as to, what exactly does the right of nature to exist entail? And it took, as you mentioned, lawsuits and all sorts of real case scenarios to work out what the rights of nature mean in practice. And this is the reason why I decided to highlight two examples of lawsuits in Ecuador, to demonstrate how judges have evolved as well. And I think what stayed with me for quite a long time and still does in Ecuador is that there has been this article from an academic professor who analyzed the rights of nature development in Ecuador. And she mentioned that she interviewed one of the judges that had served for over 8 years on the court in Ecuador. And that judge mentioned that, it's interesting how at first, under traditional environmental law, he was challenged to ask questions about permissions. He would just ask, oh, is this certain legal permission that is being asked of me allowed under the norms and standards that we have embedded in environmental law? So he was forced to have this quite technical approach to law. But when the rights of nature came about, all of a sudden he had to ask the question, does this project or whatever situation was going on, does this fit within nature's rights to exist, to have a healthy ecosystem, to evolve naturally? And by taking that sort of broader norms and values perspective from the rights of nature, he was forced to invite scientists and ecologists and citizens, all sorts of people, to the courtroom to tell him what nature might actually need to have this right to be healthy, for example. And this goes to show that I think the rights of nature in Ecuador has also shown that it is actually quite a scientific approach, in the sense that it works with the natural rights of nature to be healthy. And what does that mean? We need science to tell us what nature needs. So this is just one example of how judges have evolved in Ecuador as well. And actually, just a couple of weeks ago, we have received news in Ecuador that politicians have tried to sort of take out the rights of nature of its constitution. But the people of Ecuador have spoken, and in a referendum with a huge majority, they spoke out on behalf of the rights of nature that it should stay in the constitution. So, this is sort of what fills me with hope facing all these challenges, because it's a grassroots movement, bottom up, and it's citizens speaking out on behalf of nature around the world.
Yeah, and I suppose it's worth noting that in Ecuador, they don't operate with this guardianship structure, right? It's any citizen, or I think actually non-citizen, can bring a case relating to the violation of the rights of nature. So that's quite different, I guess, to the other examples we've mentioned. And I think that also, like, the citizen involved, I mean, the scientific side of things is fascinating, but the citizen involvement as well. And those two things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, because there's a lot of like citizen science that you see particularly around like river health and stuff in other examples. But, the involvement of people and that sort of democratic will in any of these processes seems to be vital. This can't just be like a divorced sort of legal thing that's been imposed from the top down. Often we see the most success when there is that really sort of strong grassroots element as well. And I suppose with that in mind, the kind of the example of the Mar Menor in Spain is really important. This is a saltwater lagoon in the south of Spain, home to this large number of marine species, a lot of threatened species, vulnerable species, also hugely popular with tourists. It's been the subject of all these protected statuses, a number of environmental laws in the past, which have done very little to stop it from getting horribly polluted. And, you give these sort of nasty stories about how when there have been these spikes in temperature, it's resulted in a lot of this sort of marine life sort of washing up dead on the beach. So people were clearly very outraged about this. And there was this huge public campaign, right? I think something like 600,000 signatures were gathered to try and grant the Mar Menor legal personhood. So there's been this strong civil movement behind this. I mean, how significant do you think that has been to the success of that campaign? The fact that there was this like strong grassroots element.
It definitely played a huge role, as in almost 640,000 people signed a petition to recognize the rights of this lagoon, to be healthy, to exist generally, to be restored. And this law specifically already also assigned budget to restore that lagoon. So it was a very practical law in that sense as well, for the lagoon to become healthy again. And I think what's really interesting about this example is that it demonstrated, to me at least, that sometimes, unfortunately, we need disasters before we can sort of rally up citizens and peoples to speak out against injustice. So when all this marine life washed up on the shores of Mar Menor, it led to a lot of public outrage. even in 2021, when for the second time this ecological disaster happened, and after a heat wave, tons of dead shrimps and fish and seahorses washed up on the shores, it led to such public outrage that citizens that lived around the lagoon even formed a human chain. So they held hands together and they formed a human chain of almost 73 kilometers long, which is quite long. And this, of course, led to a lot of media coverage as well. And it goes to show that, when this public outrage happened, it even inspired the minister president of Spain at the time to sign this petition. And people started, these campaigns saying, I am Mar Menor, I am the saltwater lagoon. So it also touched upon sort of the biocultural identity that the people living beside this lagoon have. And I think this is the power of the rights of nature. It wasn't just a legal instrument that they proposed to politicians to protect it better. It also touched people's hearts and really rallied them up to speak out on behalf of this lagoon. So, yeah, on the one hand, it's a sad example because in the Netherlands, we use this as an example to say, should we allow such disasters to happen before we can have enough people standing up and speaking out against injustice? And on the other hand, I think it fills us with hope because it showed that, even far right wing political parties that call this sort of, crazy idea, were not able to hold this back because so many people stood behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it definitely makes me think also of the example you give of the Ouse River in Britain. A lot of our listeners are based in Britain. They'll be very familiar with the story of our rivers being polluted with shit, by privately run water companies. And there's another number of issues aside affecting the health of this country's rivers as well. But, the story you give about the River Ouse in Sussex, it's been also the subject of a recent Rights of Nature campaign as well. And, it sounds like people became involved in the campaign for the Mar Menor as a result of their relationship with it, their identification with it as an important part of their locality. And I think the same applies here as well with the Ouse, where you have this grassroots campaign that acknowledges also the importance of like local cultural identity and the relationship of the people to that area that's in need of conservation. So could you tell us a little bit more about, the Ouse River and this, grassroots movement, I guess, dovetailing with this new kind of rights of nature legal approach?
It was actually really interesting to dive into the rights of nature movement in the UK because I didn't realize, but in the last couple years, a lot of local movements have been set up for rivers specifically in England. And it's not just the River Ouse in Sussex, but also I've seen similar efforts being undertaken for the Avon, Plym, Don, Cam. Please forgive my pronunciation. I probably didn't do that right. But basically, rivers around the UK. And I think what I've sort of researched and when I spoke to the people behind the Love Our Ouse campaign is I realized in the UK there's a lot of examples of pollution of those rivers and water quality is a huge problem. And I suppose this is, the River Ouse in Sussex. I'm dying to go there. It's not that far away from my home country, so I'm hoping I can visit it one day because it was so inspiring to see this movement gain ground in a local municipality. And what they've done is basically this grassroots move initiative held workshops where they sort of invited all sorts of people, not just people from the municipality, but also local activists, people living in the area. And they really tried to touch their hearts as to, what is the future you envisage for this river? What should we do to have that changed? And when they had all that input, they created a charter and had that signed by the local council. And I think what is really great about it is a framework to think differently about the river and to have it represented differently within the council. And this went on apparently to be an example for all these local initiatives around the UK that advocate for a similar approach. So I think I learned a lot of that example as to, again, a charter that can serve as sort of a fundamental value-based framework for decisions regarding the river, but also, again, the grassroots initiative that was able to convey the feelings and the dreams of the local peoples for this river to a city council. Love Our Ouse has a newsletter which you can subscribe to. And I think almost each week I receive new updates of their campaigns, and it's really exciting. They try to combine local education of children with council work. And it's great seeing this, take root in society.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely an overlap here between the right to roam movement in Britain and the kind of rights of the river, which we see with the Love Our Ouse campaign. Because like public access to Britain's waterways and in England's waterways particularly is very limited. I think there's only something like 3% of rivers that are fully accessible to the public. And it really feels like greater access to nature in the first place is going to be crucially important in like building this greater cultural identification and engagement with rights of nature, because, you know, how can you expect to build strong grassroots campaigns in the locality if locals have actually no right to access the places that are in need of protection? But I think, you know, you're right in pointing out that you're seeing these kinds of efforts in relating to different rivers all around the country now, and I think there must be a crossover with the right to roam movement, I think. So, you know, we've been talking a lot about how legal recognition for the rights of nature is, you know, it's a crucial first step. It's not just the end goal in and of itself, right? We need to have this major cultural shift in, you know, how we value and interact with nature and how we view our own sort of species in relation to nature as being of nature. But that this process might take years or generations. As you've already alluded to, as we all know, the ecological crises that we face on our planet are, you know, so like massive, they require rapid response. Do you think there's like a tension that needs to be resolved here between, you know, understanding that the cultural shift might take, you know, generations or years and years, with that real urgency around fighting the climate crisis? I'd just be curious to kind of get your thoughts on whether there is a tension to be resolved, or whether, you know, the growing movement for the rights of nature has a part to play in this urgent work of fighting the climate crisis.
Oh, definitely. Over time, I've realized that each of us, I believe, has a role to play in, challenging these crises that we have. And I found myself at some point jealous as well of people who would, plant trees or do real physical work that is visible to society and has a profound impact straight away. And I really applaud the people doing that. And I think from a legal perspective, I've tried to sort of look where my talents lie, which is legally speaking, in challenging environmental laws. And that's why I believe that, the work that we are doing is not something that will change things overnight. As the stories in this book show, challenges still arise. Implementation is difficult. There's all these legal and political challenges to this concept. But right of nature is really a tool, not just a legal tool to, protect nature in a better way, but a fundamental shift in how we see ourselves relating to the living world. And as long as we sort of, create more technical laws and regulations trying to protect nature, but that still stem from a worldview that treats nature as an object, a resource, property, then the law cannot do so much if, that whole worldview remains unchanged. So, looking back at women's rights and rights being based on norms and values that we attach to certain groups, they only came after a shift in values. So legal systems generally always follow society, they don't lead. And I think this is where we try to, especially in Western countries, change that perspective and have these rights of nature embedded before even more pollution takes place or before even more climate crises. impacts will, impact our society. So I believe, it's fundamental to challenge this cultural and dominant worldview that we have now as well. And that's why, even though rights of nature might not lead to concrete results tomorrow, I believe they are the legal seeds that we can plant in our legal system that future generations in 50 or 100 years' time can still use to stand up for nature. Because that's what rights essentially do. They surpass the political sort of, everyday actions that lead to this very short-based norm value that politicians enact when it comes to protecting nature. And they ensure that, even in 100 years' time, if we take the rights of nature to exist, thrive, evolve, and to be restored to heart, I think we can work with the climate crisis as well, because nature is changing so fast, and the technical standards that we enact now for a river might look very different in 10 years' time when it's changed its course, or, because of the unpredictability makes that we need strong norms and values to protect nature. So I hope this sort of answers your question as to why I believe that, rights of nature really tries to repair that worldview and give more legal tools.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're talking about trying to change like a cultural sort of paradigm shift. And in many respects, actually, it feels like it's already intuitive to people. You see in a lot of these kind of local, charter, changes or whatever, the support is very, very high. And then it's kind of economic interests that try and subvert that will, essentially. So, I mean, we do still have to have that major sort of paradigm shift so that the kind of norms that prevail in society become just commonplace, that we see rights of nature as being not this novel thing, but it's just an obvious given thing. But it also definitely feels like, I mean, capital, the logic of capitalism is a major barrier here. And like, I just wonder if you have any thoughts on how this movement, this kind of legal movement, is likely to fare against, an economic system that essentially has ridden roughshod all over the existing environmental legislation, and got us into this mess in the first place. So yeah, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I believe that's exactly the reason why we need a different approach. If we look at the failure of current environmental laws, which I, by the way, as a legal scholar, wouldn't disregard, but use this as this norms and values framework that I just mentioned. And I think what's really interesting about the rights of nature is that it challenges the worldview behind the economic system that we have now, which is built on growth, extraction, short-term profits. So, I think rights of nature sort of places this longer-term ecological flourishing first, and hopefully makes people realize as well that, without a flourishing environment, we humans have a problem as well. And what I think is essential in this regard is we have realized, for example, in the Netherlands, where I work on the rights of nature movement as well, is that we do need those actors that have a lot of money, a lot of power in the economic system to work with us as well, and to make them realize that in the longer term, this is beneficial for their children as well and their environment that they live in. I believe it's quite essential to highlight as well. And I found, for example, in New Zealand, with the legal personality of the former national park and the river and the mountain that have legal personhood there, that economic development is still possible. Dams are still being built in the river, bridges are still being built in Ecuador, which is a country that is heavily reliant on the extractive industry. It still happens. But I think the dialogue around those projects changes when the whole process of decision making goes differently, when a voice for nature is being installed that has an equal status to the legal personhood of the companies that request these projects, for example. So, because this is what critics say, right? They say, oh, each and every tree can't be cut down anymore when the rights of nature are enacted. And I think the rights of nature will go through this phase now where we work with what we can within the current economic system. But over time, will challenge the myth of, the economic system which we have now. So not the practical results that we would hope to have by tomorrow. And there are people working in different venues on that as well. For example, using, climate cases or even outside of the law field. But yeah, the worldview shift that Rise of Nature sort of presents slowly over time, and how it can introduce new governance models and force companies to, really take the interest of nature into account. Because if you can imagine yourself being a company and having legal personhood, and all of a sudden nature has this equal status to you in law, we do believe that that will have an impact on those companies to think differently. It's sort of a first crack in this, concrete wall of extractivism that we live in.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So you've already alluded to some recent developments in the case of Ecuador, but changes are clearly happening very fast in this area. And I think you note in the book how, you had to amend and rewrite sections all the time as you were preparing it. So have there been any other sort of notable developments that have, come about since you finished writing the book?
There have been many. It was, quite a challenge to write this book, as, lawsuits kept happening and changes in laws and risings up of, grassroots movements around the world. But I hope I captured enough of the, the energy that really sits within this movement in the book as well. Ever since I finished the book, a new development has happened, which I would have loved to speak about in the book as well. And that is that the city of Paris, its mayor, has enacted sort of this symbolic recognition of the River Seine, which is a really important river for Paris, as an honorary citizen. And this again goes to demonstrate this changing worldview, where she said, it's not just humans that are citizens of the city of Paris, it's the River Seine as well that has formed our history and is part of our DNA. And after the recognition of this river being a honorary citizen, she proposed a Bill of Rights, because she said as well, in 10 years' time, I won't be a mayor anymore, and we need proper laws that will protect this river. And I think this is another great local example of what the city could do as well, because in the book I spoke about, these ecosystems and laws and regulations on the state level, but also local level. And I think this is a great next example of what a city could do as well. But perhaps I might be able to write that in a follow-up to this book. But I think it's been great working on this. What's most interesting actually is I haven't visited any of the ecosystems that I've spoken of in the book. I haven't traveled. I've spoken to all these people online and by telephone, and it's been a great journey telling these stories of grassroots movement.
Well, Jessica, that's maybe a nice place to leave it. Thank you so much for talking to me today. As I say, I really, really enjoyed the book. It was there was a lot for me to learn in it, and some really inspiring examples around the world. So once again, for listeners, it's called The Forest Fights Back, a global movement for the rights of nature. It's out from Pluto Press in English, and in January 2026, so possibly already out by the time you're listening to this. So yeah, thanks once again. I really appreciate your time talking to me on the show.
Thank you very much.
That was Jessica Denauta on Radicals in Conversation. Once again, The Forest Fights Back, a global movement for the rights of nature, is 40% off for podcast viewers on plutobooks.com. You just have to use the coupon podcast at the checkout. If you like the show, then please do hit the subscribe button. We'll be back in January with our first episode of 2026. So until then, thanks very much for watching, and goodbye.